Good afternoon, my name is Brian, and today I'm going to talk to you about a sport that's been around forever, baseball. Baseball's been around since the late 1800s and is still followed today by many. Major League Baseball is split up into two leagues, the American League, also known as the AL, and the National League, or NL. In 1973, baseball decided to introduce a new position to the American League, the designated hitter. This position was added to replace the pitcher in the batting order. This means National League pitchers have to hit, while the American League pitchers do not because they have that new position. At this time, this decision by baseball was very controversial, as it still is today, leading to my claim that the designated hitter has a negative effect on baseball. It has this negative effect because it nullifies the strategy of the game, puts the American League team at a disadvantage in the World Series, and it eliminates player weaknesses while inflating statistics. My first point in arguing my claim is that the designated hitter messes up and takes the strategy away from baseball. For example, a key fundamental of baseball is bunting. Because of the DH in the American League, bunting is mostly non-existent in American League games. One of the main purposes of bunting is to advance the runners base to base to have a better chance of scoring. In most cases, pitchers are not as skilled at hitting as other hitters. So if there are runners on base when the pitcher hits, he will bunt to advance them. With this designated hitter rule, pitchers cannot hit in the American League, therefore bunting is irrelevant in most cases. So the strategy of bunting is removed almost completely from the American League while still remaining prevalent in the National League. In addition to this, American League managers barely have to manage their games with this rule. A baseball analyst from Bleacher Report stated that American League Baseball is a game that has no strategy. There is an occasional pinch hitter, defensive substitution, etc., but nowhere the same as the National League. When you look at the American League games, two lineups are often tossed up at the beginning of the game, and there is no change to them as the game goes on. This is true as there is really no true strategy with this rule implemented, therefore it has a negative effect on the game. My second point in proving my claim is that the designated hitter puts the American League team at a disadvantage in the World Series. For those of you who don't know, the World Series is the last series of games played in the playoffs in baseball. The World Series consists of an American League team and a National League that play to decide the champion. The first team to win 4 games wins. The teams alternate going between home stadiums to play these games. When playing in the National League Stadium, the pitchers are required to hit, and in the American League Stadium, pitchers do not have to hit because the designated hitter is allowed. This means American League pitchers have to hit when games are played in the National League Stadium. This puts the AL team at a great disadvantage because the pitchers haven't hit all year and are now required to hit on the biggest stage. On the other side, the National League team pitchers have been hitting all the entire year, so their skills are probably more defined and sharpened because they've been doing it all year, so this gives them a competitive advantage. In addition, the MLB Daily Dish talks about how American League managers are at a disadvantage in the World Series because they have to make National League manager-like decisions when playing in that National League stadium. American League managers have a designated hitter all year, so now they have to make unfamiliar decisions while the National League manager is used to making these decisions throughout the entire year. The argument can be made that National League teams are at a disadvantage too because they have to use the DH. But all teams have players on their bench that are capable of hitting, so that's not a big issue for the National League team because it's anybody, there's players on their bench that can hit, so that's not really an issue to them. So by this, the designated hitter puts the American League at a disadvantage in the World Series, therefore impacting baseball in a negative way. Lastly, my concluding point is that the designated hitter eliminates player weaknesses and inflates and nullifies statistics, therefore having a negative effect on baseball. The designated hitter position eliminates player weaknesses because that player does not have to play the field at all. Most of the time, designated hitters are players who are poor at fielding or throwing. This rule allows the weaknesses to be ignored. Comparing this to basketball, if a player cannot dribble, he will not succeed. This player can be the best shooter in the entire world, but he will not compete on the highest level if he cannot dribble, because you need to be able to do that. The same logic applies to baseball, and the designated hitter allows this weakness to be hidden, which is bad for the sport of baseball. Additionally, the designated hitter messes with statistics. For example, the American League team is more likely to have a higher team batting average than the National League team because the American League team has a DH while the National League team has a pitcher. An analysis from the Sportster.com stated that baseball places a huge emphasis on numbers, on numbers it tracks and records, and because of the designated hitter, those numbers are not painting an accurate picture. Statistics are relied on in baseball to study and make decisions from. If they are altered because of this designated hitter rule, it's not a good thing for baseball. In conclusion, the designated hitter has a negative effect on baseball because it takes away the strategy of the game, puts the American League team at a disadvantage in the World Series, and eliminates player weaknesses while inflating statistics. Thank you.
All right, let's start with a lot of good things. The proposition's very clearly identified. You have a clear preview at the beginning of the speech. You explain what the controversy is. You give us some context on it and explain why people in the sports field might see this as being important. So that's solid. In the body of the speech, you signpost the supporting points very clearly. I know where I was at any given time. I thought that you did a fine job on that. I think that you finish in the appropriate amount of time also, and I thought you had an excellent summary at the end of the speech. So structural stuff is all pretty solid. The content on the evidence, though, is a little bit less enthusiastic than maybe the structural issues. You rely a lot on hypothetical examples and situations, and I think that weakens the argument a little bit. You mentioned statistics several times, and I kept waiting for some statistics to show up in regard to supporting your position. The batting averages, for instance, that's the closest that you get to actually mentioning a statistic, and even then you don't provide us some examples of batting averages of teams in the American League versus the National League to illustrate the point that you're talking about. You just kind of give us this generalization about what the averages are likely to look like without providing the proof of that particular point. When you talk about the disadvantage of the teams in the World Series, for instance, I'm thinking, well, then we should be able to see some of that since this has been in place since 1973, which is almost 50 years ago. Maybe it is 50, not quite 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago. We've had that many World Series in that time. There should be some statistics that reflect how the American League team has played versus the National League team and whether or not it's had any impact on the quality of the game. The idea that the managers have less to do with what's going on in the game as a consequence, I think that may ignore a variety of other issues that managers are responsible for. I'll let the response speaker deal with that particular point, but I do think that you attempt to diminish the reverse argument when you suggest that the National League teams don't have the same kind of problem because they can have anybody hitting in this particular business. Since you mentioned, though, that earlier in the argument that the pitchers tend to be the worst hitters anyway, I'm not exactly sure why that means that this is a good thing that pitchers are actually hitting. And for example, on the bunting issue that you mentioned, it seems to me like that would be one of those things that you could find a statistic on about the average number of bunts in the American League versus the National League per game or something like that. I know that the baseball people are fanatics about statistics, and so I was kind of thinking I would get some of that fanatical statistical information in your argument, and it just feels like it's a little generic here. It's well thought out. You explain it clearly. You don't prove it as well as you could, and I think that that's what's missing in the argument. And not people don't. you know, we're not really a public speaking class per se. I mentioned those things that occasionally come up that I think are important, making eye contact with the audience, that sort of thing. I'll probably sound like an ass when I say this sort of thing, and I don't mean to, but you look awkward when you're standing there with your arms on the desk and your shoulders up around your neck, and it looks kind of like you're not really engaged here. It's just like I'm going through the motions sort of thing. So it's probably better, get your hands off the desk, gesture a little bit, you know, that sort of thing, and be more engaging that way, so you don't look like you're just kind of sloughing this off. I'm standing on the street corner leaning against the post and just giving my opinion on something. You know, it'll come across a little bit more effectively. All right, thank you.